I'm Dave Keim. I'm the Communications Director at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I previously was the Public Affairs Director at the Y-12 National Security Complex. So I've worked at two of the big facilities in Oak Ridge. The third is the K-25 site. And I want to tell you a little bit about Oak Ridge, and specifically about the graphite reactor, which became what we know today as Oak Ridge National Lab. The fact that there were three sites in Oak Ridge from the very beginning is a pretty interesting story that helps to explain how American science worked in the Manhattan Project and how remarkable that period of history was. You have to remember that scientists had only discovered nuclear fission a few years before the Manhattan Project started, in the midst of the buildup to World War II. James Chadwick confirmed the existence of a neutron in just 1932. And scientists began using neutrons for experiments. And in 1938, when two scientists in Germany, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were studying uranium, they hit it with neutrons, and it split into basically two equal parts. They were chemists, and this was a chemical result that they did not expect. So they asked one of their colleagues, Lisa Meitner, who was a theoretical physicist, why that might be. Now, Meitner had fled to Sweden because she had Jewish ancestry. And of course, in 1938 Germany, Hitler was rising to power. So through this correspondence, she thought about why the chemists might have gotten that result, and explained that perhaps it was like water droplets splitting into sort of two equal droplets, and the surface tension diminishes and it breaks apart into two equal parts. She said maybe that's what happened with the uranium atoms, where they split equally and released energy. She ran that through Einstein's E equal mc squared formula. The amount of mass that was lost matched expectations, and she told her colleagues, "You've discovered fission, nuclear fission." This was a huge breakthrough, and Niels Bohr, the famous Danish physicist, took the news to scientists in America, because he was headed to America for a conference, and the scientific community realized the ramifications of this discovery. And some of them said, what do we do with this? This was discovered in Nazi Germany. This could be a really bad thing. So some of the scientists, Leo Szilard in particular, in cooperation with Eugene Wigner, who would become the first research director here at Oak Ridge, and Edward Teller, both Nobel laureates, drove out to Einstein's house on Long Island and said, we need someone with your name to get people's attention, and we need Belgium to stop selling uranium to Nazi Germany, because uranium was mined primarily in the Belgian Congo. And Einstein did that. And then Leo Szilard met a guy who knew the president, Alexander Sachs, and said, well, we need to get a letter from Einstein to the president that explains to the president what's going on. So that's where Leo Szilard and Edward Teller went back out to Einstein's house, got him to write the famous Einstein letter to FDR explaining the potential for a weapon if one could control a nuclear reaction. And that letter got to the president in the fall of 1939. And from there, the Manhattan Project began. Now, the Manhattan Project was happening at the same time the scientists were discovering how nuclear fission would work and what might be used for nuclear fission. Not only uranium, but plutonium, another heavy element, which had been discovered and produced by Glenn Seaborg at a lab in California at Berkeley. But he could only produce microgram quantities, not enough to be of any effect for energy production or a weapon. How would you produce enough plutonium for a weapon? The physicists said, well, you need a nuclear reactor. Now, nuclear reactors didn't exist, so they had to build one. And they built one at the University of Chicago, known as the Chicago Pile. The Chicago Pile was literally a pile of graphite blocks and uranium with some neutron-absorbing rods that, as they were removed, would allow the neutrons to circulate freely and collide with other nuclei of uranium and cause those to split, releasing other neutrons that would collide with other nuclei, a chain reaction. They theorized how this would work. It worked the way they expected. The reactor went critical, sustained a nuclear reaction. Not a bad thing. It's what they expected to happen. They let it run for less than 30 minutes and declared, we know how to control a nuclear reaction. It's kind of amazing because the science worked exactly the way they predicted. This was all mathematics, and it worked. 2 months later, on February 2nd of 1943, the X-10 graphite reactor was constructed at Oak Ridge. It was a 24-foot cube of graphite with 1,248 holes in the front into which workers would slide uranium slugs clad in aluminum. And by putting enough uranium into the reactor in the right configuration, they could cause a nuclear reaction, a chain reaction, carefully controlled. But by irradiating the uranium and then pushing it out the back of the reactor into a deep pool of water, retrieving it, taking it next door to a chemical separation facility, they could extract plutonium. Enough plutonium to show that you could produce plutonium using a nuclear reactor and ultimately to build a weapon. 2 grams of plutonium were produced at the graphite reactor within about 2 months. And scientists and engineers used this knowledge to build the permanent large reactors, production reactors at Hanford, Washington, that produce plutonium for a nuclear weapon. Now, in Oak Ridge, there were 3 other facilities that were built focused on uranium. The Y-12 nuclear weapons plant enriched uranium, got fissionable uranium-235 out of naturally occurring uranium. Uranium-235 is only 0.7% of naturally occurring uranium, so you have to separate it out of the naturally occurring uranium. Y-12 used electromagnetic separation to do that. The K-25 plant used gaseous diffusion to do that, running the uranium through a series of filters until the smaller uranium-235 came through. And then the S-50 plant, which was near K-25, used thermal diffusion. But most of the uranium that was used in Little Boy, which was dropped on Hiroshima, came from the Y-12 nuclear weapons plant through that electromagnetic separation process. The plutonium that was used in Fat Man, which was the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, came from the Hanford Works in Washington State. And both of those weapons were ultimately put together and developed at the Los Alamos lab in New Mexico. So you had 3 sites in Oak Ridge, K-25 with S-50 there, Y-12 and X-10. They were built in Oak Ridge because the Manhattan Project didn't know which would get fissionable material first. The science was so new, the engineering was so new, that they had to build 3 different sites in this race to harness the atom. And nationally, there were 3 major sites for the Manhattan Project: Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. Hanford and Oak Ridge were production sites. Los Alamos was the scientific laboratory where they also tested the plutonium bombs before, to just show that those would work. It's amazing to me, looking at it, how this was all happening in real time. Scientists were debating whether it would work, how it would work, what kind of engineering and physics were needed to make it work, what the effect would actually be. And of course, there's the morality of it. Do we want to do this? Is this something that ought to be done? Should it be dropped as a demonstration? Should a bomb be dropped on the population? And these ethical debates were there from the very beginning. As for Oak Ridge and the X-10 graphite reactor, no material produced at Oak Ridge ever went into a weapon from X-10 in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Oak Ridge National Laboratory has always been a research and demonstration site where we take the hardest and newest science in the world and try to understand how to make good use of it, what the ramifications might be. A last comment regarding the Manhattan Project is that it's important to recognize that the dawn of the atomic age and the creation of nuclear weapons didn't come about because scientists were trying to create a devastating weapon of war. Scientists were just trying to understand the periodic table. They were probing elements up to uranium to understand how the world worked. And when they got to uranium, they discovered nuclear fission. And they realized the ramifications of that. And it was the scientists with that knowledge who then had to try to make sure that it didn't fall into the wrong hands and that it was used for the right purposes. After the war, really even during the Manhattan Project, once the X-10 reactor had accomplished its goal of showing how to produce plutonium, the scientists and engineers knew they had this incredible scientific instrument in the graphite reactor. How were they going to use it? One of the earliest uses was for the production of medical isotopes. The first official shipment of medical isotopes from the graphite reactor occurred less than a year after the end of World War II. And Eugene Wigner was the research director at the time. And they shipped carbon-14 to a hospital in St. Louis. And shipments have continued to this day. We still produce medical isotopes at our facilities today, the high-flux isotope reactor and the radiochemical engineering facility that is next door to the high-flux isotope reactor. So we've saved countless lives through nuclear medicine. We pioneered the use of nuclear power. About 20% of energy in the United States comes from nuclear power. It's the largest source of emissions-free energy. And we pioneered nuclear engineering and health physics in those early days. We built ultimately 13 reactors at Oak Ridge as we tried to discover which reactors would be the safest and most effective, generate power most effectively. And we trained a lot of the first nuclear engineers. We had the reactor. So if you wanted to understand nuclear engineering, you came where the reactor was. We trained those engineers and scientists until the university stood up their own programs. And one of those students who came to the X-10 site, was Hyman Rickover with a group from the Navy. They wanted to figure out if you could use nuclear power for a submarine. And Rickover figured it out. He grilled our scientists. He would walk up to them and say, "I'm Captain Rickover, and I'm stupid. Explain to me what you do." He was not stupid. He was a driver, and he figured out how to put a safe nuclear reactor on a submarine and launched the Nautilus in 1954. Today, all of the Navy's submarines and aircraft carriers are nuclear powered. And the fuel for the nuclear Navy the source material for it comes from Y-12 next door to the lab here. We also pioneered health physics, which is protecting people from radiation. We had one of the largest biology divisions in the world through the 50s and into the 60s. Leanne Russell and others used the mouse house to discover what radiation exposures were safe. The protections for pregnant women came out of that, and that biology, as science does, led into other discoveries, like the discovery that the Y chromosome is responsible for maleness. We discovered messenger RNA. A significant amount of genomic work came out of that. We supported the Human Genome Project. We do a lot with plant genomics now, trying to improve biofuels and mitigate climate change. Back to the earliest days of the graphite reactor, some of the scientists working there realized that you could use neutrons to probe materials, much as X-rays use light. And Ernest Wallen and Cliff Shull pioneered the field of neutron diffraction. When you penetrate materials and biological materials with neutrons, you can understand how the atoms move and how they behave in real time. Neutrons are really good at detecting light materials, while X-rays can detect heavy materials. And this has led to breakthroughs in medicine, in alloys and metals. We have done experiments like putting a running engine into a neutron beam to see how the components degrade over time. It's remarkable the work that our scientists do in that regard at today, the spallation neutron source and the high flux isotope reactor. So Oak Ridge is a leader in advanced materials, in neutron science, in nuclear science and engineering, and isotope production. And one of our leadership areas today, of course, is supercomputing. We have had the most powerful computer in the world several times, 3 times in recent years. And if you go back to the 50s when this started, we had most powerful then as well. And, you know, the most powerful computer in the world in 1995 is about equivalent to the iPhone that you carry in your pocket today. Computing technology has advanced incredibly quickly. What it allows us to do is to understand the data coming out of these major facilities like our neutron facilities. We right now have the most powerful computer in the United States. It was just overtaken after 2 years as #1 in the world, but we're building another one that we expect to come online in 2021. And we, of course, expect to be #1 again. We're also today, we just won a quantum science center to try to pioneer that next phase of materials research and information technology and cybersecurity. We do a lot of work securing the grid. We are helping manufacturers improve their processes and save energy. We 3D printed a car, a truck, a submersible, and are pushing the boundaries of what's possible with advanced manufacturing, which is a next phase of the advanced materials work that we've done for decades, inventing alloys that are lighter, stronger. If you can save energy as well as produce energy more efficiently, you solve a lot of the problems in the world. Think about that. Think about all of the improvements that you want to make anywhere in the world. You want people to have good jobs. You want people to have good health care. You want people to have opportunity. In America, we wake up every morning and we don't think for a second that when we hit the light switch, the light's not going to come on. We don't expect for a minute to go to the gas station and not be able to get gas, although some of us who remember the 70s maybe are more likely to think about that. Why can we live the way we do? It's because we know we have enough energy. We know the energy is going to work. If you live in a country or a city where you're not sure that the electrical grid is going to work today, what does that mean for your ability to sustain industrial production, to have hospitals with equipment that can save lives, to be able to innovate anything? You have to have clean, abundant energy for a growing global population. And Oak Ridge National Laboratory is right in the middle of producing more energy, using the energy we do produce more efficiently, and coming up with alternative forms and alternative ways to do that. And we let that science lead us into new areas across the research spectrum. It's an amazing place to work, and it started with the X10 graphite reactor. I'm glad that you're interested in this. If you want more information, go to ornl.gov. You can take virtual tours of some of our facilities on our interactive map. And we certainly hope to meet you someday at the laboratory when we're open again after this pandemic, where we're also contributing significant research using our supercomputers, using our biological expertise to try to find a cure and a way to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Thank you for your time and your interest.